In a quiet, tree-lined suburb, in a house filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies and old books, lived the Miller family. It wasn't a large house, but it was a home built on a foundation of love, laughter, and shared dreams. At the heart of it were Mark, a man whose hands were calloused from years of hard work, and his daughter, Lily, a 17-year-old with eyes that held the sparkle of 1,000 future possibilities. Mark had spent the last 2 decades working at a mid-level logistics firm, a job that didn't ignite his soul, but paid the bills and allowed him to provide for his family. Every morning, he'd put on a brave face, straighten his tie, and walk into an office where he often felt invisible. But all the fatigue and frustration of the day would melt away the moment he came home to Lily. She was his pride, his joy, his reason for everything. Their bond was forged in small, quiet moments. He was the one who taught her how to ride a bike, holding on until she pedaled away with a triumphant smile. He was the one who sat with her for hours, helping her with math homework until the complex equations finally made sense. And she was the one who would listen intently as he spoke of his day, offering him a cup of tea and a comforting presence that made him feel seen and valued. For as long as Lily could remember, there had been 2 constants in their home: her father's unwavering love and the old ceramic jar that sat on the highest shelf in the kitchen. The jar was labeled Lily's Dream Fund, in her mother's elegant handwriting. It was much more than a simple savings container. It was a vessel of hope, a tangible symbol of a promise. Inside that jar, bit by bit, was the future they were all building together. Lily's college education. Ever since she was a little girl, Lily had dreamed of attending a prestigious university to study literature. She wanted to lose herself in the world of classic novels, to understand the power of words, and perhaps one day, to write a story of her own. Her parents, who never had the chance to pursue higher education, nurtured this dream as if it were a delicate flower. They saw in her a potential they had never been able to realize in themselves. The fund was a family effort. Her mother, Sarah, would squirrel away whatever she could from the grocery budget. Lily contributed her earnings from babysitting and working summers at the local bookstore. But the lion's share came from Mark. Every bonus, every overtime check, every small windfall went straight into the jar. He made countless sacrifices, forgoing new shoes when his old ones were worn, fixing the car himself instead of taking it to a mechanic, and never complaining. When Lily would tell him he deserved something nice for himself, he would just smile, tap the ceramic jar, and say, "This is what I deserve. Seeing you fly." As Lily entered her final year of high school, the dream felt closer than ever. Her grades were excellent, her application essays were polished, and the fund had grown to a substantial amount. It was almost enough to cover her first year's tuition and board. During their Sunday dinners, the main topic of conversation was the future. They would spread university brochures across the table, their faces glowing with excitement and anticipation. The world felt full of promise, and the path ahead seemed bright and clear, paved by years of shared sacrifice and unconditional love. The ceramic jar was not just full of money, it was full of their collective hope, a testament to what a family could achieve when they were united by a single beautiful dream. The atmosphere at Mark's firm, Prestige Logistics, was the complete opposite of his warm and loving home. It was a place of muted gray cubicles, artificial lighting that hummed with a constant, draining buzz, and a palpable tension that clung to the air like static. The source of this tension was Mr. Harrison, the regional director. He was a man who seemed to derive pleasure from wielding his power, a corporate predator who moved through the office with a chilling blend of arrogance and disdain. He spoke in a tone that was perpetually condescending, and his praise was so rare it was considered a mythical creature. Mark had always tried to stay under Mr. Harrison's radar, doing his work diligently and quietly. He was a reliable employee, consistently meeting his targets, but in a world that valued aggressive self-promotion, his steady, unassuming nature made him invisible. He had been passed over for promotions twice in the last 5 years, watching his younger, more charismatic colleagues climb the ladder, leaving him behind. The rejections stung, not just because of the financial implications, but because they reinforced his growing sense of inadequacy. He felt like a cog in a machine, easily replaceable and utterly unappreciated. Recently, the pressure had intensified. The company was undergoing a restructuring, a corporate euphemism for downsizing that sent waves of fear through the entire office. Rumors circulated in hushed whispers by the water cooler about who would be next to go. Mark, with his stagnant position and quiet demeanor, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The thought of losing his job was terrifying. It wasn't just about him. It was about Lily. How could he look her in the eye and tell her that her dream, the one he had promised to protect, was in jeopardy? It was during this time that a new opportunity, or what seemed like one, emerged. Mr. Harrison was celebrating his 25th anniversary with the company. and the senior staff were organizing a lavish dinner in his honor. Mark overheard a group of ambitious junior executives talking in the break room. They weren't just planning to attend, they were planning to impress. They spoke of strategic gifting, a way to show loyalty and secure their positions in the new corporate landscape. One of them mentioned that Mr. Harrison was an avid collector of luxury watches. The idea lodged itself in Mark's mind and refused to let go. It felt cynical and transactional, a betrayal of his own values. But desperation was a powerful motivator. He started to see it not as a bribe, but as a strategic move, a necessary sacrifice to safeguard his family's future. He imagined the scene, presenting a beautiful, expensive watch to Mr. Harrison, earning a rare smile, a nod of recognition that would finally make him visible. Perhaps it would lead to a promotion, or at the very least, secure his job through the restructuring. The extra income from a promotion would mean he could replace the money in Lily's fund in no time, with even more to spare. He began to rationalize his thoughts, the whispers of his conscience growing fainter under the roar of his anxiety. It's an investment, he told himself. An investment in Lily's future, just in a different way. He tried to picture the alternative, losing his job, the Lily's Dream Fund jar sitting on the shelf, full but useless, as they struggled to even pay the mortgage. The fear was paralyzing. One evening, after a particularly grueling day where Mr. Harrison had publicly belittled him in a team meeting, Mark made his decision. He waited until Sarah and Lily were asleep, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked into the kitchen. The ceramic jar on the high shelf seemed to mock him, a silent monument to a promise he was about to break. His hands trembled as he lifted it down. It felt heavier than usual, weighted not just by the coins and bills inside, but by the years of sacrifice and hope it contained. He emptied its contents onto the kitchen table, the sound of the coins clattering like a judgment against him. He counted the money with a growing sense of nausea, separating the bills until he had the amount he needed. He avoided looking at his reflection in the dark kitchen window, unable to face the man he saw. With the cash clutched in his hand, he carefully put the remaining money back in the jar and placed it back on the shelf, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. He had crossed a line, and a cold, heavy guilt settled deep in his soul, a secret that would now sit between him and the daughter he adored. The days that followed were a quiet torment for Mark. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe freely in his own home. He tried to act normal, to maintain the familiar rhythm of their family life, but the secret was a chasm that had opened between him and the people he loved most. He'd find himself staring at Lily as she sat at the kitchen table, excitedly scrolling through her university's website, and a wave of shame would wash over him so intensely that he'd have to leave the room. He'd make excuses, a phone call he had to take, a work email he forgot to send, anything to escape her bright, trusting eyes. He couldn't bear to see the reflection of his betrayal in her innocent gaze. Sarah, his wife, noticed the change. She saw the new shadows under his eyes, the way he'd flinch when she touched his arm unexpectedly. "Is everything all right at work, honey?" she asked one evening, her voice laced with concern. Mark forced a smile and nodded, the lie feeling like sandpaper in his throat. "Just the usual pressure with the restructuring. It'll be over soon." The trip to the jewelry store was the most surreal experience of his life. He felt like an imposter as he pushed open the heavy glass door, a chime announcing his arrival into a world of polished wood, velvet displays, and hushed reverence. The air smelled of money. A salesman with slicked-back hair and a predatory smile glided over, his eyes appraising Mark's slightly worn suit. "How may I help you, sir?" the salesman asked, his tone dripping with a politeness that felt more like a challenge. Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm looking for a watch." He was shown a selection of timepieces that cost more than his car. Each one was a masterpiece of engineering and design, gleaming under the bright lights. They felt cold and alien in his hands. He finally settled on a classic, elegant model with a silver face and a dark leather strap, the kind of watch a man like Mr. Harrison would appreciate. As the salesman processed the transaction, Mark's hands trembled so badly he could barely sign his name. The total came to a figure that made his stomach churn. It was a significant portion of what he had taken from the jar. "A gift for a special occasion?" the salesman inquired, sliding the watch box and the receipt across the counter. "Something like that," Mark mumbled, avoiding eye contact. He quickly took the box and stuffed the receipt into his coat pocket without a second glance, his only thought being to escape the suffocating opulence of the store. The receipt was a flimsy piece of paper, but it felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric, a permanent record of his transgression. The night of the anniversary dinner arrived with a sense of dreadful inevitability. As Mark got ready, he felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his gut. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, but the man looking back at him was a stranger. His face was pale, his eyes haunted. He had told Sarah and Lily he was attending a mandatory company event. Just as he was about to leave, Lily came to his room. She was holding a small, clumsily wrapped gift. "I wanted to give you this," she said, her voice soft. "For your dinner. So you remember you have us cheering for you." Mark's heart cracked. He unwrapped it to find a simple, handmade leather keychain with his initial M stamped into it. It was something she must have made in her art class. It was a gift of pure, unadulterated love, and it was more valuable than 100 luxury watches. "Lily," his voice broke. He pulled her into a hug, holding her tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. He wanted to confess everything, to tell her he was sorry, to undo the terrible mistake he had made. But the words wouldn't come. Fear and shame held them captive. "I love you, Dad," she whispered into his shoulder. "I love you too, sweetheart," he managed to say, his voice thick with unshed tears. "More than you'll ever know." He pulled away, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He slipped her keychain into his pants pocket and picked up the coat containing the watch box. The weight of the box in one pocket and the receipt in the other felt like the scales of justice, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was utterly and completely out of balance. The restaurant chosen for Mr. Harrison's anniversary dinner was the kind of place Mark had only ever seen in movies. It was a world of crisp white tablecloths, glittering chandeliers, and waiters who moved with a silent, choreographed grace. The air was thick with the murmur of self-important conversations and the clinking of expensive crystal. Mark felt deeply out of place, a simple rowboat adrift in a sea of luxury yachts. He clutched the gift box in his hand like a life raft, the smooth, polished wood a stark contrast to his calloused palms. He found his assigned table, nodding awkwardly at the other mid-level managers who were already engaged in animated, sycophantic laughter at something a senior executive had said. The entire evening was a performance. Everyone was playing a part, their smiles carefully calibrated, their compliments meticulously crafted. Mark watched as, one by one, his colleagues approached Mr. Harrison's head table to present their strategic gifts. There were bottles of aged whiskey, rare cigars, and even a set of monogrammed golf clubs. With each gift, Mr. Harrison would offer a curt nod and a thin, dismissive smile, his eyes already scanning the room for the next tribute. When his turn came, Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He walked towards the head table, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He felt the eyes of his colleagues on his back, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "Mr. Harrison," Mark began, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the opulent room. "Congratulations on your 25th anniversary. I wanted to give you this, as a small token of my respect and appreciation." He handed the box over. Mr. Harrison took it with an air of entitled boredom. He opened it, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of genuine interest crossed his face as he saw the watch. He lifted it from its velvet cushion, examining the silver face under the light. "A very respectable choice, Mark," he said, his voice carrying just enough surprise to make Mark's hopes flutter. "Thank you." It was more than Mark had expected. A small, warm wave of relief washed over him. Maybe, just maybe, he had done the right thing. He returned to his table, the knot in his stomach loosening just a fraction. He had survived. The investment was made. Now he just had to get through the rest of the night. Meanwhile, back at the Miller house, what was meant to be a quiet evening was about to take an unexpected turn. Sarah had decided to do a bit of early spring cleaning, wanting to surprise Mark. As she was tidying up his closet, she noticed his heavy winter coat, the one he had worn to the jewelry store. Knowing it wouldn't be needed for months, she decided to take it to the dry cleaners. As she prepared it, she checked the pockets, a habit born of years of laundering her husband's clothes. Inside one pocket, her fingers brushed against a thin, crinkled piece of paper. She pulled it out. It was a receipt. Her brow furrowed as she read the name of the store, Argenti and Sons Fine Jewelers. Her eyes scanned down the slip, her confusion turning to disbelief, and then to a cold, sinking horror. The item description read, "Men's Chronograph, Silver Edition." But it was the total that made her gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The amount was staggering. It was a sum so large, so far beyond their means, that it made no sense. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the receipt trembling in her hand. Where had Mark gotten this kind of money? The question echoed in the silent room, and with a sickening lurch, the answer began to dawn on her. Her eyes darted to the hallway, towards the kitchen. With a sense of dread, she walked to the high shelf and lifted down the Lily's Dream Fund jar. The moment she held it, she knew. It felt lighter. Her hands shaking, she emptied the remaining contents onto the table. The small pile of bills and coins was a pathetic shadow of what it should have been. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. It wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal. Just then, Lily came home from a study session at a friend's house, her face bright with her usual cheerful energy. "Hi, Mom. What's going on?" she asked, dropping her backpack by the door. But her smile faded when she saw her mother's pale, stricken face and the scattered money on the table. "Mom? What's wrong?" Sarah couldn't speak. She could only hold out the trembling receipt. Lily took it, her eyes scanning the paper. She read the name of the jeweler, the description of the watch, and then she saw the price. She looked at the money on the table, then back at the receipt, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a horrifying clarity. The dream she had nurtured for years, the future she had been so sure of, suddenly felt like it was dissolving into dust. The room began to spin, and the only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart, a drumbeat of disbelief and a pain so sharp it stole her breath. When Mark finally returned home, the celebratory dinner had long since ended, but the bitter taste of compromise still lingered in his mouth. He walked in, exhausted but clinging to the fragile hope that his desperate gamble had paid off. The house was quiet, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence, not the peaceful quiet he was used to. The lights were on in the dining room, and as he walked toward the doorway, his heart sank. Sarah and Lily were sitting at the dining table. They weren't looking at him. In the center of the table, like an indictment, lay the jeweler's receipt. Next to it was the meager pile of money left from the Dream Fund. The ceramic jar sat empty. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The secret he had carried for days was now out in the open, exposed under the harsh dining room light. "Dad." Lily's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. It was a voice he had never heard before, stripped of all its warmth, its trust, its light. It was the voice of a stranger. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, red-rimmed and filled with a pain so profound it made him flinch, met his. "We were going to use some of that money this weekend to pay for my application fees. Mom went to get the jar." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. The excuses he had rehearsed, the rationalizations that had seemed so logical in his desperate mind, now felt like pathetic, hollow lies. Lily picked up the receipt, her hand trembling. Her voice grew stronger, each word sharpened by a sense of deep and unforgivable betrayal. "It says here," she began, her voice gaining a cold, clear volume, "that you bought a men's chronograph silver edition. For your boss. You took the money we all saved. The money I saved from babysitting, from working summers. The money Mom saved from groceries." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "You took it, and you used it to buy a watch for a man who doesn't even know your name." She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She spoke with a devastating calm that was far more painful than any outburst would have been. She was simply reading the facts, laying his betrayal bare for all of them to see. "Lily, Mark started, his voice cracking. "I can explain. It was for us, for our future. I was trying to protect my job, to protect you." "Protect me?" Lily stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "You think this is protection? You think this betrayal was for me?" She let out a laugh, but it was a sound completely devoid of humor. It was a brittle, broken sound. "You didn't protect me, Dad. You sold my dream. For a watch." He saw then, in the shattered look on his daughter's face, the true cost of his decision. It wasn't about the money. It was about the trust. He had taken something sacred, their shared hope, their collective sacrifice, and he had tarnished it. He had broken the unspoken promise that had been the bedrock of their family. He looked at Sarah, who sat silently, tears streaming down her face. Her expression wasn't angry. It was one of deep, profound disappointment. That was worse. Anger would have been easier to bear. In the days that followed, the house was a cold and silent place. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a strained, painful quiet. Lily retreated into herself, speaking to her father only when absolutely necessary, her words clipped and devoid of emotion. Mark moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by the echoes of what he had lost. The watch had earned him that coveted nod from Mr. Harrison, but he had come home to find his entire world in ruins. He had gained the attention of a man who didn't matter, and lost the respect of the one person who mattered most. He realized then the terrible irony of his actions. In his desperate attempt to secure a future for his daughter, he had destroyed the very foundation on which that future was meant to be built. The road back would be long and difficult, paved not with money, but with the slow, arduous work of rebuilding trust, one painful, honest conversation at a time. It was a journey he had to take, for Lily, for his family, and for the man he desperately wanted to be again, a man worthy of his daughter's love. The empty ceramic jar on the kitchen shelf was a constant, silent reminder of his failure. But it was also a reminder that hope, once broken, can be pieced back together, even if the cracks always remain. It would take time, and it would take a strength he wasn't sure he possessed, but he had to try. For Lily, his real dream wasn't a university education, it was his daughter's happiness. And that was a dream he could never, ever give up on again.